Okay, the last line of the opening stanza or opening verse, his notice sudden is, we notice the awkward syntax used by Dickinson here, because normally you would expect her to say or to write, I suddenly noticed him. But his notice sudden is a little bit disjointed. It's very odd. She uses inversion, she's kind of twisting and changing the order of the words here, and that might suggest a sense of fear, a sense of unease, perhaps, because she's familiar with this creature to a certain degree, but then this creature, of course, can inspire fear and trepidation in quite a lot of people, including the poet. I mean, think about it, a lot of people have a phobia when it comes to snakes. So in the second verse, then, we were looking at the grass divides as with a comb, obviously emphasizing the use of the simile there. Remember, she tends to use quite a number of similes and metaphors. So it's a strong visual image again. So the imprint left behind then by the comb is kind of a wavy imprint, or a line simply left behind then by the comb as it moves through the hair is very similar then to the snake, of course, moving through the undergrowth and moving along the grass. So it's dividing the blades of grass and then they spring back, of course, into position or place then. A spotted shaft, of course, is obviously the pattern, the unique scaly sort of pattern, the snake skin itself, the spotted shaft. The shaft then, of course, is just the thinness of the body itself. And then it closes at your feet and opens further on. So there's kind of a simple, smooth, sort of slinky, serpentine movement of the snake then as it slithers along or through the grass. So if you kind of think about it, there's a contrast then, of course, between the poet who's sort of transfixed by the movement of the snake, and then we have the snake, of course, who just glides effortlessly through the grass or the undergrowth itself. He likes a boggy acre. Now, if you think of boggy acre, it can simply mean just waterlogged or marshy ground. But if you think about it, this kind of ground is sort of inhospitable. As she mentions in a moment, then a floor too cool for corn. So it's not exactly the type of habitat that would welcome a human being or other creatures. So it sort of emphasizes the otherness of the snake again. Okay. Notice, of course, how she continues to use quite a lot of alliteration. We had the spotted shaft is seen in the second verse, using the hissing, sibilant S sound, recreating, of course, the sound of a hissing snake. If you think about a floor too cool for corn, think of the kind of guttural C sound there, obviously reinforcing something harsh perhaps as well. And that's in keeping then, of course, with the fact that she's exposing the kind of dark side, the underbelly of the snake itself at this particular point of the poem, just kind of gradually introducing more sinister images as such. Notice how she's using the word floor rather than ground here. If you think about it, floor would suggest something more familiar, something that we associate with a domestic arena, a house or a home. So it's kind of emphasizing the idea, it's almost like the snake is intruding on her area or her place, whether it be the garden, of course, or whether it be just simply beyond that, where she normally goes for a kind of perambulation, for a walk, a daily walk, essentially, to there. So she is just simply observing it as it moves and then commenting, essentially, then, of course, on its habits. Yet when a boy, now this is quite strange, this bit here, because we realise, of course, that for the first time in our study, that Dickinson is using a persona, persona, okay, and that she's pretending to be another person. It's almost like a character, essentially, which is kind of strange because if you think about it, her poetry is very personal. And she's usually, of course, emphasizing her own unique perspective and her own take then on various subjects and ideas and so on. So she imagines herself then as a boy, and the boy then is telling us this particular account or this story as such then. And we have to think about why she uses this particular persona. And I think she uses it because it's the notion, we'd say, of a boy, perhaps a young boy, being kind of blithe and sort of thinking that he's invincible and that nothing phases him. Fearless, essentially. But it's the notion, of course, that we're all very vulnerable. I mean, think about it, that's very topical at the moment, essentially, that we're all vulnerable and we're all frail and sort of fragile to a degree. So when a boy, of course, it's the idea that the boy then would think that he's stronger than nature. The boy would assume, of course, that he can do whatever he wants to nature, that he can exploit or manipulate nature. And barefoot, I think barefoot, of course, would suggest the idea of going out and exploring, of course, when you're a child, running across the grass barefoot. But also barefoot would suggest a kind of vulnerability again. So it's kind of reinforcing the idea then, you see, that perhaps boys at that particular time would have the opportunity and the freedom then to explore, whereas girls wouldn't. And then boys would have a different attitude towards nature, perhaps, that girls and women would have. Even notice the use of alliteration again. Boy and barefoot has kind of a breathless B sound to it, the idea perhaps of kind of running out and exploring, that sense of adventure that I've mentioned. I more than once at noon have passed, I thought, a whiplash. Okay, so think the idea of a metaphor here, comparing then, of course, the furled or rolled snake. We kind of think about the spiral of a snake then as it's resting or sleeping. And comparing that then, of course, obviously to a whiplash. And if you think about it, that's a very clever image to use because it's a strong visual again, which is a hallmark of her poetry. But also when we think about a whiplash, it does suggest the idea of punishment and pain as well. And that could, of course, emphasize the notion then that the snake has the potential, of course, to do harm. Okay, if you think of a poisonous snake or even a snake bite, essentially, too. Or even the notion, of course, of a snake, we'd say, kind of a boa constrictor image of being squeezed to death. I mean, obviously that's a very extreme image, but it's kind of suggested or implied then. So the boy then says, of course, I more than once at noon have passed, I thought, a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. And unbraiding means kind of unfurling. Okay, so it sort of rolls itself up into a spiral and then it unfurls, essentially. So unbraiding then, braid is actually a nice kind of image as well, because it does suggest that particular image of being coiled or being wrapped around something. And then if you take a braid out of your hair, then of course you have these kind of loose waves that are left behind. So when stooping to secure it, this is the natural inquisitive nature then of the boy. He's very curious. And it's the idea then, of course, that the boy would naturally want to capture or to take the snake for himself. So stooping to secure it, to catch it, it wrinkled and was gone. So it's very quick, it's very agile, it's very nimble, of course, and it's reinforcing how elusive the snake is. And that relates back to the general theme of nature, of course. Just when we think we've managed to control or master or tame it, it surprises us. There's a lot of parallels, obviously, when you're reading this particular poem, between the ideas that she's exploring in the poem and what's happening out in the real world, which is the whole point of poetry when we really think about it. Notice the use of the alliterative sibilant S sound again. Sun, stooping, secure. I kind of think there's a nice image there. If you think of stooping, that would almost suggest an older person, an elderly person who's kind of frail, and then wrinkled would kind of reinforce that particular image. So it's kind of the idea the boy thinks, of course, this fearless boy, he thinks that he's strong and invincible, but he's not actually. He's actually quite weak and he's actually quite frail, perhaps. So she continues then the last two verses. Several of nature's people I know. So think of nature's people. It's kind of reinforcing the idea of being familiar with nature. But then think of nature's people, it does suggest the idea perhaps that they're a separate clan or tribe as such, that they're still very different. And perhaps we have a long way to go in attempting to understand them or grasping, we'd say, the nuances of nature's people. So several of nature's people I know, and they know me, is the idea of kind of recognizing them, but maybe not truly understanding. I feel for them a transport of cordiality. Now, cordiality is an excellent word to use here because it does suggest the notion of just being friendly, almost like an acquaintance. You're on speaking terms, but it's quite shallow or quite superficial. It doesn't really go beyond that. So a transport, we kind of think to be transported, to be moved essentially here. I mean, sometimes you would kind of think or assume that that would mean overwhelming feelings, but it's not though. It's just sort of the idea that she has a sort of a friendly yet slightly guarded attitude towards nature. And that's reinforced then, of course, by the boy himself having to understand that, having to come to some sort of accommodation or understanding then with nature itself. Okay, so cordiality, we kind of think about just polite interaction, and kind of reinforces the idea, of course, that we need to respect nature, but we need to be alert, of course. We need to be cautious and wary of nature and the threat that it poses. And the final verse then, of course, she reinforces that particular notion or message. But never met this fellow attended, so either if I'm accompanied, of course, by other people, so perhaps with her brother or sister-in-law, mother, perhaps father, or alone, without a tighter breathing and zero at the bone. So this really emphasizes then a more natural response, perhaps, and also we'd say a wiser response to nature. So first of all, if we look at zero at the bone, it's an excellent way of describing something that is bone chilling. Okay, because zero would suggest, of course, 0 degrees, kind of frozen almost. So frozen, essentially zero at the bone, and then a tighter breathing would suggest becoming almost panic stricken. Okay, kind of restricted breathing here. So it's the idea of shock, and then the idea of panic, and then the idea of, we'd say, being petrified, which literally means, of course, to be turned to stone. So she's kind of documenting then throughout her different responses and different attitudes towards nature. And the idea, of course, that the young boy has to learn and has to understand, of course, the perils of nature. And then Emily Dickinson is emphasizing her more mature response to nature itself. Okay, so that's just a kind of a basic sort of overview of the poem, looking at a few different aspects of style, as well as the general overall theme. And that, remember, is our third poem. So it's a good idea, of course, if you have a look at the notes, and then if you, we'd say, focus on writing a paragraph on theme, and then maybe a paragraph on style, and practice that. And you can always, email me any little bits and pieces that you have within the next kind of couple of weeks on that as well. So we'll be moving on then to our fourth and final poem, which is After Great Pain. So if you have a read through that a couple of times, and then either later this week or next week, then I'll post a little, these are very simple analyses basically of these particular poems. If you want something that's a little bit more detailed, I can do that as well. But I kind of think it's quite difficult when we don't have a classroom scenario and we're not able to kind of engage properly. Although at least I wasn't interrupted this time. At least I could actually say what I wanted to say. I didn't have Abraham sort of constantly nattering away in the corner. So, like I said, if you just keep up to date with the emails and the work then that I'm suggesting, and if you want to suggest any other formats or any other ideas, go ahead. There's no problem with that. Keep well, guys. Bye.